Oh, thank you so much for this presentation. I always learn so much from other people's descriptions of my activity. It's obviously a great honor to be here in the Big Apple, and every time I had a chance to come here, I'm always fascinated by this mélangé context, which is so attractive to me. And I will also today speak about, in a way, mixed societies which were very much frequented by Western pilgrims in the late Middle Ages, and I would try to explain how this context started being perceived as important as holy sites during the late Middle Ages and the early, let's say, Renaissance, if we want to use this old-fashioned categories. So it is a well-known fact that with the fall of Acre in 1291 and the end of the Crusader presence in the Syro-Palestinian coast, the practice of pilgrimage to the holy sites did not really come to an end. This was partly due to the enduring Latin presence granted by the settling of the minor friars in Jerusalem and in the most important shrines from 1334 onwards, and that by the somewhat later creation of the Custodia di Terra Santa. Franciscan spirituality, with a strong Christological emphasis, undoubtedly played a major role in keeping alive the Westerners' interest for the outre-mer voyage and in promoting new forms of devotion for memorial sites are the most important gospel events. Admittedly, the latter proved to be less attractive than in the past, as they were often associated with ruined, old-fashioned buildings which could not really compete with the much more solemn and impressive basilicas marking the pilgrims' goals in the western side of the known world, such as Rome or Santiago. As a kind of compensation to the disappointing appearance of many Jerusalem holy sites, the Latins tended to multiply their objects of interest and to enrich the sacred topography with new meanings. Instrumental were, in this context, the reconstruction of instrumental in this context was the reconstruction of Christ's station during the Way of the Cross, as well as the attribution of precise indulgences to each site, both inside and outside the walls of the Holy City, even if the latter proved to be nothing more than nude rocks on the city's sacred soil, or an otherwise anonymous group of bricks on a street wall. The friars insisted that the religious importance of such scanty places was outstandingly deeper than any other cult object, given that the earth itself, which had been so frequently touched by Christ's incarnated body, had been sanctified. This concept was explained in the following terms by Francesco Suriano, a Franciscan writing in the second half of the 15th century to the addressee of his treatise on the Holy Land. It has an Italian name, and I quote, "Those things which touched Christ only for a while were strongly imbued with his virtue and grace. Indeed, the more one approached him, the more he was sanctified. and whoever got very near to him, he received much more grace. Yet this blessed earth was touched by him at the highest degree, and consequently it is completely filled with divine virtues and turned into a most holy abode. By a kind of transitive act, everything being produced by that holy land was by itself imbued with extraordinary qualities and divine virtues. And I quote, "Because of that," continues Suriano, "the Holy Land's trees, woods, vegetables, grass, bread, water, stones, and everything else there is holy and filled with virtue." End of quotation. A self-evident witness to this principle was the fruit of the so-called musi tree, our banana, which was considered to be nothing less than the paradisiac fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Each pilgrim was regularly astonished at seeing that its pulp bore the imprint of Christ's crucified body, as if it were a kind of natural acheiropoieton. I made many efforts, and actually if one looks at it attentively, it is possible to see a kind of figure with arms, elevated arms. So maybe they were very fanciful, but anyway, it was very frequently quoted by late medieval pilgrims to Jerusalem who enjoyed this very, very good fruit. All this was enough to boast that no other pilgrimage goal could be compared with Palestine, given that this geographical entity itself was to be considered a Christological contact relic, enabling at the same time even a direct experience of the incarnated one's salvific action. His holiness was so firmly grafted in the soil that there was no need to enhance it by means of sumptuous architectural frames or manifest it by way of synecdoche through the mise en scène of a specially attractive holy object. It was almost automatically perceived as a cultic and visual focus for worshippers and could eventually be turned into a movable relic when one was so impudent as those lucky pilgrims who were so clever to bring a chisel in their bags and did not give a damn about the friar's recommendations and managed to remove some fragments out of the rock of Calvary or the walls of the old churches. Nonetheless, the visitors to Mamluk Palestine were not thoroughly at ease when observing that the most celebrated places of Christendom were completely deprived of the relics, images, and other sacred attractions which they were accustomed to associate with the major shrines or with the treasures of town cathedrals. In 1458, the Englishman William Way, in his effort to define a kind of geography of Christian relics, found it difficult to include the Holy Land in this topography and was forced to just mention the objects which were known to have been translated from there to either Constantinople or Rome. And at the end he hinted only in a somewhat contradictory way to the stones imbued with the Virgin's milk in the homonymous grotto in Bethlehem, which were, by the way, also a segment of the sanctified earth of Palestine. In order to find authentic relics, it proved necessary to leave the Holy Land and cross the sea from Jaffa, Beirut, or Alexandria towards Venice, the town which, from the 14th through the 16th century, held a sort of monopoly over the navigation routes between Western Europe and the holy sites. To each alt along this sea route corresponded, according to Way, a rather articulated web of shrines, which were absolutely worth being worshipped by the pious pilgrims. And I quote in kind of translation. I made first 20 miles from the port of Salin, Larnaca on Cyprus. There is the cross of the good thief, which is said to hang within a chapel, although it is not fixed to any support. Then in Rhodes there is a thorn of Christ's crown, which flourishes for 1 hour on Holy Fridays, at the very moment when the Passion of Christ is being read. There is also the Virgin and Martyr Catherine's left arm, as well as a cross made out of the basin which Christ used to wash his disciples' feet. There is also one of the 30 coins by which Christ was sold by the betrayer Judas. Further on in Candia is preserved the head of Saint Titus, disciple of Saint Paul. Then in Cassopoli, that's Cassiopi on Corfu, is a lamp hanging in front of the image of Our Lady, which is filled with oil only once in a year, and nonetheless it keeps burning with the same oil during the whole year. Then in Ragusa, that's Dubrovnik, is preserved the arm of Saint Blasius. Then in Zara, in Dalmatia, Zadar, is the whole body of the wise Simeon who held Christ in his arms. Then the bodies of Saint Servulus the Confessor and Saint Anastasia the Martyr. Such sacred attractions enriched the major ports of the Eastern Mediterranean and constituted altogether a sacred topography that step by step was perceived as an important religious experience, being preliminary and in some way introductory to that of the Palestinian holy sites. But such extraordinary mementos were marked of the Latin, mostly Venetian-ruled outposts in the Aegean and the Levant, and they happened to form a kind of symbolic front against the Turkish enemy. Moreover, the sites being invested with such new religious meaning corresponded to the web of safe landing places located along the fundamental sea route connecting Western Europe with the Mamluk Empire via Corfu, Modon, Crete, Rhodes, and Cyprus. In this intermediate and somewhat unusual space, the pilgrims spent a large part of their time, and it was there that they got more and more anxious to be physically involved in the sites touched by Christ's passage on earth. In each of the ports which they happened to stop, their wish to appropriate the holiness of their final goal stimulated them to search for holy signs that proved to anticipate, even if only partially, the extraordinary experience that they expected to feel in Jerusalem. In order to suit such needs, some already existing cult phenomena were invested with a thoroughly new meaning, and thoroughly new shrines were eventually set up and provided with a self-standing legendary pedigree. Admittedly, the constitution of holy places, retaining in some way the flavor of the Holy Land in territories located outside the Holy Land, proved to be a rather stressing exercise. Indeed, different strategies could be worked out in order to obtain this outcome. I will try herewith to mention the main ones in very general terms. The most common and most traditional was a negative one. I mean, the creation of an alternative Holy Land, boasting for a sacred meaning, being analogous or even more important than the Palestinian holy sites. Such were namely the major Christian sites of Rome, Santiago de Compostela, or to the opposite side of the Christian world, the holy city of Eshmiadzin, the site of the first evangelization of Armenia and the resting place of the most important Armenian saints, such as the holy martyrs Chripsime and Gaiane, which you see here, some pictures. The town holiness, I mean Eshmiadzin's holiness, is still today considered by the Armenians to be so great that it is constantly evoked and visualized even within their own holy sites in Jerusalem. In a way, it is as if the holiness of Eshmiadzin had to be transplanted into the ground of the holy city itself. Some neighbor countries of Palestine could eventually pretend to be considered extensions of the Holy Land's holiness. This was particularly true with Egypt, whose soil had been admittedly trampled on by Christ's feet. Consequently, the stop places of the Holy Family along the Nile Valley, such as the Garden of Mataria, or in Heliopolis, or the crypt of Abu Sarha in Old Cairo, were and are regarded as very important mementos of Jesus' life. The Mataria should have been used. The Mataria should have been used by the Holy Family as a kind of nursery. There Mary had washed the baby and his garments. There a supernatural balsam had started being poured out from a nearby tree, which is still in the present day worshipped as a cult object. You see it here in the picture. In Abu Sarha, the main altar was erected exactly over an underground cave, which was said to have been the first dwelling place of the Holy Family in Egypt. Yet, if the holiness of the land resided in its memorial meaning, one could allege that also the territories visited by the apostles and mentioned in the Acts of the Apostles in their frequent voyages around the Mediterranean constituted an extension of the Holy Land. The memorial sites of Poes landing on Crete, a grotto close to Kalilimenes, and a small church in the deserted village of Aia Rumeli were hot spots within this sacred topography, yet they're being located on the island's south coast, far from the major navigation routes, probably prevented them from becoming much frequented pilgrimage sites. On the contrary, from the late 15th century onwards, when the Venetian ships started landing at the small port of Paphos in the southwestern part of Cyprus, the pilgrims started manifesting their interest for the ruins of some ancient baths, which were interpreted as the prison where the apostle and his pupil Barnabas had been forced to stay for a while. Analogous memorial sites, and by this word I mean sites where there is almost nothing to see, sites which have no relics, no cult objects. We have only a segment of holy ground to show. So analogous memorial sites could be established as far as Italy. From the 13th century onwards, the sumptuous church, sumptuous Romanesque church of San Piero a Grado near Pisa, was said to mark the very place where Saint Peter had disembarked into the Italian soil, and where he had erected the first Italian altar. In this case, the cult phenomenon aimed at rivaling Rome's claims to primacy and to emphasize Pisa's leading role as an important pilgrimage site. The church was conceived as a sumptuous architectural frame around a small column marking the spot where St. Peter had built up his altar. In the late 13th century, the church was provided with a huge cycle of scenes representing the story of the apostles and partially reproducing the program once decorating the atrium of St. Peter's in Rome. A much more elaborated mise-en-scène of the holy spot was obtained in the 14th century when a Gothic ciborium was erected over it as a visual indicator to its site-bound holiness. More developed strategies of Holy Land evocation were worked out during the late Middle Ages. A popular one functioned by synecdoche. It is by installing a fragment of the sanctified soil of Palestine as a visual focus for a new shrine. A case in point is the Pisan Camposanto, which was erected around the field of holy earth transferred to Tuscany from the Jerusalem Hakel Damach. It has the bloody field bought by Judas with his 30 coins, which was said to possess the miraculous power to prevent corpse decomposition. So, I mean, this very important Gothic architecture should be considered for its very focus. Usually we look at the frame, but we don't look at the very center of this, which is this soil with nothing. Okay. In this case, the Holy Land was distinctively treated as a movable relic. Similar strategies had been frequently worked out already in the previous centuries. On the top of Mount Gerizim or Gerizim, which was identified by the Samaritans as a biblical Moriah, the Christians had included a fragment of the rock of Golgotha in the walls of the basilica erected there in the 6th century. In this way, the Samaritan Temple Mount was symbolically superseded by its Christian counterpart on the Mount of Golgotha. In Jerusalem itself, the holiness connected to other holy mountains happened to be evoked by synecdoche. A case in point is the worship for the stones of Tabor, Gerizim and Sinai included in the altar entitled to the Holy Echmiadzin, again, in the Armenian Cathedral of St. James. In that very spot, it was as if the sacred dynamis of 5 holy sites together were being manifested at the same time. So Tabor, Gerizim, Sinai, Jerusalem, and the Holy Echmiadzin, the Armenian holy city. An analogous yet less complex case is that of the Greek Orthodox Chapel of St. George in the annexes of the Holy Sepulchre, where the worship for a stone of Mount Sinai enables the pilgrims to visualize the principle by which the Mosaic law was just a shadow, an anticipation of the age of grace, starting with Christ's sacrifice on the nearby Calvary. Typologically similar to this pars pro toto strategy was also the evocation by means of a collection of Christological and especially of Passion relics. This was very common and very traditional in the Middle Ages, and almost every town or political entity aiming at assert its own prominence happened to provide itself with prestigious remnants of the crucial events of Christ's life. Such objects as the holy hood of the cross itself, the nails, the crown of thorns, the veils and funerary lintels, and so on, were regarded not only as contact relics, but also as elements of the Jerusalem cityscape at the very moment of the crucifixion. Therefore, the title of New Jerusalem could be attributed to any other place preserving such most holy mementos. The most important treasures of this kind were the Pharaoh's chapel within the imperial palace of Constantinople, the Lateran church, and the nearby private chapel of the popes, the Sancta Sanctorum in Rome, and from the mid-13th century onwards, the Sainte-Chapelle of the French kings in Paris. In the 14th century, when the kings of Cyprus made of the port of Famagusta the capital in exile of the lost kingdom of Jerusalem, they made all possible efforts to provide the Latin Cathedral of St. Nicholas and the other town churches with at least some important Christological relics. An alleged jar of Cana was exposed in a small church entitled to Santa Maria de Idria. It was an astonishing piece of Islamic pottery, a sumptuous vase from Andalusia, whose exotic appearance stimulated its perception as an important memento of the Christian origins. It was accordingly exhibited within a special domed chapel. After the Cypriot sack of Alexandria in 1367, the King Peter I of Lusignan even managed to obtain from the Mamluk Sultan a piece of the flagellation column, indeed a memento which could work as mediator of a partial synecdochical translatio Jerusalem. The column could indeed be interpreted as a minimal part of Jerusalem's landscape which could be transferred elsewhere. This had long since taken place in Jerusalem itself, where the column was no more worshipped in its original site, as in the hardly localized praetorium of Pilate, yet in the Holy Sepulchre itself, and in at least 2 or even 3 forms, corresponding to the rivaling cult phenomena promoted by the Latins here, the Armenians, and the Greek Orthodox. Not surprisingly, analogous fragments of the same column, each one in a different color, were venerated also in Constantinople and in Rome. But this is just logical, just obvious. Yet, for the most part, the other countries were forced to limit themselves to a more or less complex analogical evocation. It is by attributing the cultic meaning associated with the holy sites of Jerusalem to some focal elements of a natural or town landscape. So, for example, by characterizing the higher hill in a community's vital space as Golgotha or Golgotha, or to put it simply, as Jerusalem. So, for example, the inhabitants of Impruneta near Florence were naturally inclined to attribute the title of Sancta Jerusalem, San Gersole in Tuscan dialect, to a small village located somewhat upper on the top of a hill in the neighborhoods. This could be combined or not with a mimetic imitation of the material buildings framing the holy spots themselves. And finally, as is especially evident in the case of the later Sacrimonti and Kalvarienberg, there could be a much more precise effort to operate a topographical transposition, something that did take place only when the whole system of spatial relations between different holy spots was applied to a different geographic context outside the Holy Land. In the maritime spots of the Aegean and the Levant, the web of shrines specifically connected with the sailors' piety and religious needs played undoubtedly a much more evident role than the apostolic memoirs. The multi-ethnic and trans-confessional crews of the Venetian ships had long identified a number of sites whose alleged holiness was determined not so much by their intrinsic or historic meaning, but rather by the evocative shape of the coastal landscape, or in other words, by the important role played by promontories, islands, bays, creeks, and cliffs as orientation points for navigation. Even if they consisted for the most part of celebrated and shared shrines, a number of such peregrinaggia marittima was visited almost exclusively by sailors. They looked mostly as rather anonymous chapels, small churches and hermitages, which were invested with a special meaning only for those who saw them from the sea, because of their being located in eminent points of the coastline. When a ship was lost in the open sea and eventually braved the danger of a dead calm, the only thing to do was to scan the horizon and invoke the miraculous appearance of one of such shrines. For such a purpose, the sailors had even invented a very unconventional litany, usually performed in Italian language and known as the Sante Parole, the Holy Words, by which the sailors asked for the help of the sites themselves, which were so enumerated according to a geographic sequence, in a kind of holy portolano starting from Alexandria and going through the Aegean, the Adriatic, the Tyrrhenian Seas and the Atlantic Ocean, up to the coasts of England and Zealand. So maybe I can just read part of this litany. It sounds like that. Dienai e Madonna Santa Sava d'Alessandria. Dienai! It means God save us. It's a very, very strange expression, even for the Tuscan dialect. Dienai e Madonna Santa Caterina del Monte Sinai, Dienai e Santo Salvador della Lecce, Dienai e Madonna Santa Margarita de Carme di Soria, Dienai e San Giorgio di Baruti. So it's God save us, and with him Saint Savas in Alexandria, God save us, and Saint Catherine of Mount Sinai. God save us and the Saint Savior of Latakia in Syria, La Leccia. God save us and Saint Margaret on Mount Carmel. And then Saint George of Beirut, Our Lady of the Cave in Famagusta, the Holy Cross of Cyprus, it means the Stavrovuni mountain, Saint George in Castellorizo, Saint John and Saint Anthony in Rhodes, Our Lady of Philarimos in Rhodes, Saint Nicholas in the small island of Kharki, this is Saint Paraskivi in Candia, and Our Lady of Frascia by Candia, and then so on. Saint Isidore of Chios, Saint Phocas in Pera near Constantinople, Saint Sophia in Constantinople, Saint Francis in Kaffa, Crimea. So you see that the navigation goes everywhere, the need to invoke every kind of coastline, since they want to be saved from the dangers of simply losing the route. And then on Saint Demetrius Thessaloniki and the monastery of Saint Michael on Malia's Cape, Saint Francis in Coroni, Saint Leo in Modon, Saint Mary in the islands, in the Strophades Islands, Saint Mary in Cassopoli, Saint Maria in the small island of Sazan in Albania, and then Saint Blasius in Ragusa, and Saint Gregory in Zara, and Parens, and up to Venice, and all the Mediterranean coasts are so invoked. In the Eastern Mediterranean, the Holy Portolano included such places, I must say, such disappointing places, as the cave monastery of Our Lady of Frascia, close to Candia, which proved to be a safe landing place on the occasion of storms and strong winds. I made efforts to find this place on Crete, and there is no way to get there from Earth. You have to go there with a ship, from the sea. There's no other way. The small island of St. Nicholas, also known as Sazan or Sazeno, at the mouth of Valona port, which was an outpost of the Venetians. It was actually ruled by them, just in front of the Turkish territories. And the small church of the Panagia Cassopitra on Corfu, which was located in a bay sheltered from winds in the neighborhoods of the very dangerous Straits of Butrintos. separating Corfu from Albania. You know, navigation in this traitorous sea was very dangerous, not only because of creeks, not only because of storms, but also because of Albanian pirates. So, as is witnessed by written sources from the mid-14th century onwards, the sailors and pilgrims were there often forced to stop in this bay, which was completely deserted and accessible almost exclusively from the sea. During their stops, they started paying attention to a small chapel whose distinctive trait was its being continuously and mysteriously illuminated by a lamp. According to a widespread story, this lamp was lit only once a year by a Greek priest, and for the rest of the year it kept burning in a much miraculous way, as if it were established by God as a kind of lighthouse for the sea people. At a certain moment, somebody felt the need to take off a piece of bark from the nearby fig tree and to dip it into the oil of this lamp. This later proved to be a very efficacious remedy against fevers. The sailors' frequentation stimulated a more and more sophisticated mise-en-scène of the holy site and a more precise definition of its legendary coordinates. In the late 14th century, a hermit was permanently living there near the icon of the Virgin Mary, which already by 1440 was said to be an original work by the evangelist Luke. Such an attribution was probably meant to conform this extraordinarily popular and well-known cult phenomenon to the most usual paradigms defining the qualities of an especially prestigious Christian image. The miracle working power was considered to be the consequence of an alleged relic-like status made evident by its being made by an eyewitness of Mary's outward appearance. Nonetheless, nothing is known of the icon's destiny, probably destroyed during the incursions of the famous Turkish pirate Barbarossa in 1537. It was substituted by another image in 1590 when the church was reconstructed by the Venetians. Its outward appearance is probably reproduced in a mural painting in the nave, a late 16th century fresco. It is not by chance if it represented the Virgin in the type connected with the most venerated icon in Venice. It has the so-called Nicopea preserved in San Marco. The site's emergence as an authentic holy site, enhanced by its spatial mise-en-scène and its legendary pedigree, took place when it was included in the sacred topography of the sea routes to the Holy Land. In this context, the attribution to St. Luke enabled it to present itself as one of those evangelic memoirs which the pilgrims were eager to approach. Actually, the Virgin of Cassiopi was just one of the many analogous images dotting the main ports along the Levantine sea route. And here in this map they are marked by the yellow rectangles. They are all images by St. Luke. So, after worshipping the Nicopea in Venice, the pilgrims had a chance to honor further original icons by the hand of Luke in the Cathedral of Dubrovnik, Ragusa, in Cassiopi, and in the Greek monastery in the Strophades, where the so-called Virgin Thalassomachusa, the Virgin fighting with the sea, was venerated there as a miracle-working image. Further on, there were other images in the Church of St. Dominic in Modon, in the Franciscan convents of St. Francis and the Holy Saviour in Candia, on the summit of Mount Philarimos on Rhodes, in the Greek Orthodox Cathedral of Nicosia, and in the monastery of St. Sabas in Alexandria. And let's see some of them. This is the Virgin Thalassomachusa, now preserved in Zakynthos. And this is the Holy Virgin once in the Cathedral of Candia, now the famous Virgin Mesopanditis in the Venetian Church of Santa Maria della Salute. And this is the very odd face, holy face of the Virgin once venerated on the top of the Mount Philarimos, whose worship had been fostered by the Hospitallers, the Order of the Hospitallers, and for many years scholars and devotees thought that it had been lost. This icon has a very, very crazy story. It was transferred to Malta in 1531 with the fall of Rhodes to the Ottoman army. And then in 1791 it was brought to Russia from the last Great Master of Malta, and it eventually came into the possession of the Tsars of Russia, who kept it in their private chapel in the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. And the Bolshevik legend said that it had been destroyed by the Bolsheviks as a kind of, you know, act of, I don't know, violence against the symbolic Anhaltspunkte of the Tsars. But the white faction during the Russian Civil War had really taken it and brought it to Germany, given to the local Orthodox, Russian Orthodox authorities, who on their turn gave it to the King of Yugoslavia. So with the bombing of Belgrade during the Nazi bombing of Belgrade in 1941, it was brought to Montenegro and kept in a monastery in Cetinje until 1997, when it was discovered and restored. Now, if you want, you can admire it in the museum at Cetinje. But anyway, this is the strange story of this incredible icon. Sorry, I'm speaking German. In other words, it was an almost uninterrupted web of alleged autograph works by the evangelists, marking the whole extension of the sea corridor separating Christian Europe from the Mamluk and Ottoman-ruled countries of the Middle East. According to the Western devotees, their common authorship was revealed by some recurring compositional and stylistic features, which proved to be those associated with Cretan icons made according to traditional or less traditional Byzantine schemes. The pilgrim Felix Fabri in 1480 witnesses that the shopping in Candia was one of the most exciting experiences for a pious visitor to the Levant, given that there was a very intensive production of images of the Most Holy Virgin, and I'm quoting, which are being painted in a very lively way according to the features used by St. Luke to paint the icon of the Virgin Mary. The promotion of a cultic phenomenon centered upon an image said to be extraordinarily ancient and due to an eyewitness of the holy ones proved to be just one of the strategies being worked out to promote those otherwise liminal places as stages for sight-bound manifestations of the holy. A good alternative was offered by the public exhibition of bone fragments pertaining to those saints whom the pilgrim expected to worship at the end of their voyage. So, for example, relics and memoirs of St. George, the martyr whose execution stone was regularly visited in his church at Lydda, the present-day Lut, near Tel Aviv, could be seen in the neighborhoods of Beirut, where the episode of the dragon fighting was localized, in the monastery of Stavrovouni on Cyprus, in the sacred collection of the Hospitallers in Rhodes, and obviously also in Venice itself. So before starting the trip. The pilgrims wishing to visit St. Barbara's tomb in Old Cairo and perhaps to bring there a painted ex-voto, like the Catalan work now preserved in the Coptic Museum, could prepare themselves to this strong experience by performing prayers before her arm in Venice, before her head in the Latin Cathedral in Candia, or in front of a column located in a church in Beirut, whose purple veins were said to have been produced by the blood poured out from her neck at the moment of her beheading. Yet, a very special attraction was obviously exerted by the relics of Saint Catherine, whose bodily remains, preserved in the Sinai Monastery, constituted, if not the main goal, at least a fundamental stop during the trip from Egypt to Jerusalem. Those pilgrims who managed to reach the summit of Mount Horeb to see the site of God's revelation to Moses never failed to climb up to the steepest peak of the Jebel Katrin, where they had the chance to kiss and sprinkle with tears the holy rock wherein the angels had laid and guarded for 5 centuries the blessed corpse of the martyr. In order to see the latter and take advantage of its extraordinary virtues, they had to move into the interior of the Catholicon next to the site of the burning bush and approach the ark, which contained it and poured out a miraculous liquid, the so-called miron. After making the ritual devotions, they were allowed to pin to their dress a pilgrimage token shaped as the cocked rod or wheel, which was used in the late Middle Ages as the main iconographical attribute of the saint. Yet, even if one was prevented from accomplishing the very dangerous pilgrimage from Cairo to Sinai, there were anyway other chances to manifest one's devotion to the great martyr and miracle worker. The foreigners who were going to board the Venetian ships could get acquainted with Sinaitic tradition by worshipping an ampulla filled with the holy liquid poured from a body, which was preserved with great honors in the church of San Daniel. Later on, once they had crossed the Adriatic, the Ionian and the Aegean seas, they could finally meet with the Alexandrian saint just before starting the voyage to the Levantine Sea. This took place namely in Rhodes, within the private church of the Great Master. This building was entitled to St. Catherine herself, and a number of luxurious tapestries illustrated the major episodes of her life. Her left arm was there publicly exposed within a precious reliquary which we know only from this sketch. By such means, the Hospitallers made efforts to intercept and attract the extraordinary devotion that the pilgrims nourished for this holy figure. Analogous concerns were shared in the two successive landing places. When, after crossing the huge Gulf of Antalya, the ships finally berthed at Famagusta on Cyprus, the pious devotees who had to spend some days in the most remote stronghold of Christianity in the Levant did not fail to make a stroll up to the ruins of the old Roman town of Constantia. From the 14th century onwards, the latter was described to them by their local guides as St. Catherine's true native town. They pretended that the saint, who was otherwise universally known as St. Catherine of Alexandria, was known as such only because she had moved to Alexandria when she was 13 years old, and mostly because there she had been martyred. Since her father was named Costus in some late versions of her life, they used this witness as a clue to her association with Constantia, Costus Constantia, and according to this fanciful etymology, we can secretly told that the name Famagusta was to be interpreted as Fama Costi. It has Costus's renown. The visitors had so the chance to visit a ruined building not far from the early Christian Basilica of Epiphanius in Salamis, which was indicated as either the saint's house or her school. Not very far from the spot, within a large necropolis, a tomb dating back to the 7th century before Christ was identified with the site where the mystical marriage had taken place. In order to strengthen this connection, a painting displaying this theme was located in the interior. Yet, from the late 15th century onwards, it was already worshipped as the saint's prison, regardless of the fact that according to all existing geographical sources, the moments of the martyrdom had all taken places in the great Egyptian port. But that doesn't matter. The tomb chapel was said to have been filled with murals chaotically scattered on its walls and displaying many coats of arms left there by the Western pilgrims. In the present day, only a small cross sculpted over the door to the inner grave remains as a testimony to the centuries-old use as a Christian cult place. Clearly enough, the Famagustans aimed at promoting their own town as a privileged goal for Holy Land pilgrims by working out an alternative holy topography. This was partly obtained because in the late 15th century, the visitors to St. Catherine's prison were allowed to pin to their garments half a wheel, by which they witnessed that half of the indulgences connected to the pilgrimage to St. Catherine had been already earned by them. Yet, this did not prevent pilgrims from localizing in Alexandria the most heroic and celebrated actions of the martyrs. First, it was possible there to see the true prison, being a very small underground room, and inside it a small window, which, according to legend, had been opened by the angel who daily brought food to the saint. Nearby were located two columns, probably remains of an ancient building, which were said to have served as supports to the cot rod. Another drum of column marked the place where her beheading had taken place, as was clearly witnessed by its white color with red veins, which was thought to have been produced by the blood and milk poured out from the saint's neck. In the same place, the Greco-Milkite church of St. Sabas, where the icon painted by St. Luke was preserved, proved worth being visited because it marked the place of the house where she had lived. Notwithstanding the overlaps and misunderstandings underlying all these traditions about the topography of St. Catherine, the pilgrims felt extremely rewarded if they managed to visit all of the sacred memoirs scattered between Famagusta, Alexandria, and Sinai. The Italian notary Nicola de Martoni, at the end of the 14th century, was especially satisfied with the grace received by the Almighty, by which he had been enabled to see with his own eyes omnia facta beate Caterine et gesta Peream, of the sites connected with St. Catherine and the memoirs of all her action. So, the site of the places associated with the saint's birth, martyrdom, and burial corresponded, at least in this special case, to a meditation exercise, being not unlike the one which in the Palestinian holy sites was expressed by means of a mental and emotionally charged evocation of the main gospel events, and especially of the Passion. If compared with St. Catherine's story, which could be much more easily manipulated or even distorted, the latter could hardly be associated with sites outside the Holy Land without contradicting the Holy Scripture. In order to evoke the memory of Christ's deeds, it proved consequently inescapable to work out some completely different strategies of cultic promotion. So, an absolutely original expedient was found by the regular canons of the Latin Cathedral of St. Sophia in Nicosia, who promoted the public worship for an ancient jasper sarcophagus that was said to have been made out of the very stone of the aniconic idol of Venus, worshipped in the neighborhoods of Paphos by the ancient Cypriots. According to this old legend, the Cypriot had heard that the Jews were going to cause Jesus' death on the cross. Upon Jesus' refusal to follow them to Cyprus, they would have carved the idol in order to have it ready and to use it as burial site for his corpse. Yet his pious intention had been made vain by Christ's bodily resurrection. Nonetheless, it should have been appreciated by pilgrims as a missed sepulchre, and given that its creator's intention had been genuine, it proved to be at least as venerable as the empty sepulchre in Jerusalem. So, probably I'm speaking too much, or shall, well, okay, just a much more easily way was that of the mimetic or analogical reproduction. Some clues indicate, for example, that the Hospitallers made efforts to transform their town roads in a kind of New Jerusalem by building up a copy of the Holy Sepulchre in their own cemetery and by attributing to the main churches the topographic function associated in Jerusalem to the stations of Christ's way to Calvary. The special Rhodian context seems to have exerted a direct impact onto the development in Western Europe by the early 16th century of the so-called Calvaries of Chemin de Croix. An official document dating from 1516 witnesses that the Way of the Cross, established in Fribourg, Switzerland, on the initiative of the Hospitaller Knight Pierre d'Anglisbert, had been modeled on the Rhodian archetype. On its turn, the Way of the Cross in Fribourg was the primary source of inspiration for the somewhat later one in Romans-sur-Isère. Both can be considered as parallels to the contemporary yet more articulated and mimetically organized Sacri Monti. An even more important role was played anyway by the metonymic or synecdochical evocation connected with the installation of Christological relics and gospel memoirs. A very important one was established in the general quarters of the Hospitallers in In St. John of Calacian, there almost everything was there. There are several fragments of the true cross, a cup which was said to have been owned by Saint Martha, and so probably to have been used by Jesus himself. A precious cross made out of the basin used by Jesus to wash his disciples' feet. And the most dramatic events of the Passion were evoked by the worship for one of Judas' 30 coins. These were used in a very odd way, more like the Agnus Dei in Rome. So they made an imprint in wax and distributed it to pilgrims who took them as a kind of amulets against thorns and fires. There was obviously the already mentioned thorn of Christ's crown. There was a thorn of Christ's crown, which was, however, not so holy as the one preserved in the private chapel of the great master himself, since this one, there was a distinction. Not all thorns of the crown of thorns were very holy. I mean, those thorns which had perforated Christ's flesh were obviously more venerable as the other ones. So, this one preserved in the private chapel of the great master had perforated Christ's flesh, and consequently it flourished on Holy Fridays and produced very amazingly nice white flowers for just 1 hour. Then the Hospitallers were lucky enough to receive also the right arm of Saint John the Baptist, which was obviously very important for them. They were the Knights of Saint John, and so this proved to be extremely important. But it should be said that Saint John's right arm could be perceived also as a Christological relic, as it was with this arm and with this finger that he had indicated in Christ the Lamb of God. And so here you see some representations. For the same reason also there were fights between Venice and Ragusa and Zara, about the possession of the body of the wise Simeon, who had held the Christ child in his own arms, and so he had been sanctified by contact with Christ's body. It was himself a Christological relic. And I would like just to end this paper with some hints at another interesting phenomenon, which is strictly connected with the patterns of piety being exported into the Levant by the minor friars. The worship of Saint Francis as the alter Christus, the new Christ, was expressed in a very efficacious way, not so much by the diffusion of his images, and not even of his relics. There are no relics of Saint Francis, actually. His body was concealed and made inaccessible to pilgrims, so there were no bodily relics of Saint Francis. In a way, just as there are no bodily relics of Christ himself. And so there was rather the establishment of a specific sacred topography of the alter Christus, being marked by the most important mnemotopoi of the saint's spiritual itinerary, so at Assisi, Laverna, Griccio, and elsewhere. According to the much widespread view, Assisi stands for Francis' Holy Sepulchre, and whereas Laverna, the site of his stigmatization, was obviously compared to the Mount of Calvary, and the many fissures that you see in the mountain, represented in this picture, were cited as clues to this parallelism, as they reproduced the fissure produced by Christ's blood on the rock of Golgotha. In this respect, the memorial sites connected with Francis' famous voyage to Egypt and his visit to the Mamluk Sultan during the Fifth Crusade could be profitably integrated into the wider web of the Mediterranean holy sites and could work as an extension of Francis' own sacred topography. This possibility was especially exploited in the observant convent established in Candia in the 15th century. There, the pilgrims could access an otherwise anonymous well, which was nonetheless said to have been built by the poor of Assisi with his own hands. Thank you.